Sabers. Chinese military, European military, lots of militaries have used sabers for, I don't know, a long time, a long, long time. So we're going to take a look at a bunch of sabers that we have here, some Chinese and some European. So let's jump right in. This one, I think this is a real beauty, this saber. It could be as early as the 17th century. It's definitely at least 18th century. It's a fantastic example of a Bannerman saber, an officer's saber. We can compare some details between the other ones later. The way it has these very nice filing here, this called Doucher Dao teeth, and also the style of the fullering speaks to it being an earlier piece. Hard to see that's really on camera, but has a very pronounced hardened edge. So this is a chen gun saber. That means the inserted hardened edge. Chen means inserted, so inserted steel saber. So a real beauty. I love this piece. It's a really fast one. This is what we would call a goose quill. And the definition, or the way you say it as a goose quill versus other types of Chinese sabers, is that for about 6 inches, there's no set length. It is double-edged here. And it's straight enough that I can deliver a thrust with that, or any way that I'd come in with the thrust, I can use that. So what I really like about these, of course, practicing a lot of Jianfa as well as Daofa, is that I can use pretty much all my Jian techniques with a saber of this type. So real beauty. The other thing that's interesting, germane to this conversation of European sabers versus Chinese sabers, is that this type of saber, even though this is, I think, even the very latest this is would be Qianlong period, but I think it's very solidly 18th century, perhaps maybe 17th century, is that this form dates back into the Ming Dynasty and was in use by Qing forces right through the end of the dynasty. So although this particular example is fairly old, another way we can tell that is very solid, honest iron fittings. I love the honesty of iron fittings. This type of saber was used right through the end of the dynasty. The next one here, just for comparison, these three, by the way, would be the most common styles of sabers that we'd find in China from the beginning to the end of the Qing period. This one is a willow leaf. Now it's had a little bit, it's worn here a bit at the tip. This is where it's worn here. That would have come up, that would have swept, the cutting edge would have swept up to a tip that came across here. Obviously it's a bit more heavily patinaed, but this is a willow leaf, so a gently curving willow leaf saber, Liuyedao, and it's a bit heavier than the other sabers, so it's interesting because you're not going to use the tip quite as much. You can use it for a jaw, downward poke, or upward thrust, but this is a comparison. We'll take a quick look. You know, one is significantly straighter, right? You can see how that's got a nice gentle curve, and this one is pretty much dead straight and then just accelerates at the tip a little bit. So that's your Yanmaodao or your goose quill saber, and the willow leaf or Liuyedao. Also, this is later. I'd say this is probably 19th century. It's a wider blade, so it's going to cut better, right? You can see that's another interesting comparison, right? They're about the same weight, but this one is not as wide, and so it's thicker. And at the back, I should say, the width at the back is about the same. I'd say there's no significant difference, but this makes this a stronger blade in the sense that, right, it's not so thin, so the edge isn't going to be as thin. So this, again, it tends to be an earlier way of making blades because it can stand up to the heavy cutting, but won't be quite as efficient a cutter as a wider blade like this, where it's thinner and it's more razor-like, if you will, and that's going to be much more of a better cutter, but not quite as robust. If you hit something hard, more likely to damage the edge.
Well, I won't pretend I don't have a little bit of saber envy, seeing those excellent blades.
Saber envy, that's a great term.
It is, isn't it? Well, I mean, what I've got here is kind of a smattering of different European blades, and kind of doing some compare and contrast. We've got this British 1822 infantry officer's sword here, which is a pipeback blade, so it feels very light and lively in the hand, in the same way that when you hold a jian, there's a liveliness to it, although this has a very different balance. So this saber, or one very like it, probably would have faced off against a Dao like that during the Opium Wars or even later on in the Dynasty. And what's kind of interesting is when you hold a very light saber like this, you feel like, oh, it's got this liveliness, it's going to be very quick, I've got all these advantages. And then you look at the pipeback blade and you compare it to this wide chopping blade, and there's just no comparison the type of cut that this Dao can give versus this very thin pipeback saber. And I mean, ultimately, there's a reason why pipeback blades were abandoned.
Yes.
At some point, they're very light, they can be razor thin, and that's excellent. But they don't wear as well as a Dao like that might.
And I understand. I remember reading something once where during the Crimean War, the British had trouble with these things giving the point. Mm-hmm. Because the Russians have, had heavy winter coats on, and these wouldn't pierce because they flexed too much.
Yeah, this one, and I don't want to mess with it too much here because it's not my own sword, but this would definitely flex quite a lot in the thrust. Whereas that, not so much.
Okay, let's trade up here for a moment. Wow, yeah. So immediately you feel how much lighter this is, right?
Yeah.
But that also means it's faster, right? I mean, this is kind of the thing. Like, yeah, that definitely, there's no question. That's going to give a far more robust cut. Mm-hmm. If I had to say, which one would you want to be cut with? I'd be like this one, because it's not, and even the balance is back a little bit. I mean, it's got a lot more reach though, right? I mean, let's just put those side by side again. I mean, what is that? It's like 5 inches more reach. So when you can get a thrust in there, that's gonna certainly got reach.
Absolutely, and I feel like tactically speaking, if I were the person using that pipeback sword and I'm facing against this Dao that I would be naturally quite afraid of in that confrontation, what I'd be praying for is that you overcut so that I can then make use of that additional liveliness and speed to just hopefully get past this husho and cut your hand or your forearm.
Right.
But speaking of the husho, I mean, if you take a look at this thing, this is a serious, thick, powerful husho. That's going to protect your hand significantly better than this folding guard, at least on the inside.
Right. This has one of those very interesting kind of folding guards. This is a great example of how, that people always trying things and a lot of experiments don't work. Like that makes it so that, when it's on your hip and you're walking and it's banging around your hip, you get a flat surface there instead of that kind of, that hitting your hip constantly really is annoying. So they came up with that, but the problem is that breaks really easily, right? So that's not going to stop a solid cut from a sword like that.
Oh, certainly not.
It's probably going to go right through.
And I mean, you have the knuckle bow on that sword, which is great. You do have this additional protection on the side.
Yeah.
But an interesting conversation you and I have had previously is that despite the relative smallness of most husho on Chinese swords, we don't often get hit on the hand any more frequently than any other type of martial art because we're deflecting rather than blocking, right?
Yeah.
I don't need to rely on the additional hand protection because I'm not putting my hand in a position where it's likely to get struck in the same way.
Yes, it's very interesting because, Chinese did come across these. I mean, the Opium War from 1860s right through to the Boxer Rebellion, Chinese would have been fighting Europeans who had swords with various kinds of more complex guards, and the Chinese never said, "Oh, that's a good idea, let's do that." So, but I think it's exactly right because you're deflecting rather than parrying and staying closer. Your hand shouldn't be being hit if you're doing it properly.
Right. So. And I gotta be honest, even just for aesthetics, I probably would have stuck with the husho anyway.
Right.
It looks great.
It does look nice. But if I switch back here, the other thing I think it's kind of curious to me because clearly you got more power here, right? And not just power in the cut, but power, I think, in the deflection, right? Because it'd be interesting. That's fast. Just wondering, am I come around quickly enough? It feels like I probably can come around quickly enough. Maybe that'd be interesting. I don't know. I mean, of course, it's going to depend on the two swordsmen. It's not always just the weapon. But you're not going to ever strike me if I'm using my blade properly, hit me hard enough with that to break me down at all. Right? I don't see that my arm would give from a strike from that sword. Whereas
my arm probably will. I was just about to
say.
Well,
that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, right? Yeah, so you may go to parry, and this may hit you hard enough that it causes you to falter.
I would probably
That'd be an interesting thing to see.
Blade contact if I could. If you and I were matched up and I had this sword, since I have the reach advantage anyway, I'm probably going to try to stay back. But even if this were a shorter saber with a similar weight, I would not want to oppose Dao directly if I could help it. I'm probably going to try to void and strike for the hand whenever possible.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You got to have a totally different strategy for which type of saber you're using.
Yeah, and it's funny because
assuming you're facing the other type, right?
Yeah, and if you just say, "Oh, we're both using sabers," that sounds like an even matchup, but this is very clearly not.
And they're very, and it's also, I think, philosophically very different. You know, I'm not trained at all in the military saber stuff, but I've, of course, seen people doing it and visited people's schools. And it does seem they hardly just mostly go from the wrist and look for that quick little riposte, you know, whereas the Chinese Daofa, you're often looking for a far more, you know, I always say it's like a hungry tiger, right? You're looking to really take territory. So when you want to deliver that really devastating cut that you can then follow in with and really overwhelm and shape the battlefield to your advantage and take your Duifeng's territory. Whereas this seems, what do you think? I mean, you've done some saber.
I've done a decent bit of saber. I mean, I certainly wouldn't call myself an expert, but I will say that if I was facing that Dao, I would happily let you take territory. If this were a dueling situation where I had lots of space,
yes, that's right.
I will happily let you take that space if I can comfortably leave it. As long as I have space to retreat, I'm fine with that. Because again, and not just because of the reach advantage, I simply can't oppose your sword. I cannot afford to let you get any closer to me, especially because, I mean, in Chinese Dao,
I think I'd be being cautious that because your sword's faster, I don't want to push in too hard or too fast. So I don't think it's too clear cut. I mean, it always comes down to, of course, again, the swordsman and the ground. Right. You know, I mean, do you have room to move? Are there other people around? But I can see how each weapon has some advantages, disadvantages facing the other one.
I mean, ultimately, maybe if we were in this situation, we go, this isn't worth it. Let's go have tea.
Well, I'm not sure when the British faced the Chinese, that was really an option.
Right.
So what's, like, this one is much longer.
Yeah, so this is actually a fairly interesting sword. So this is a Franco-Romanian sword. So the blade itself is an 1822 light cavalry officer saber blade. And this blade saw service from 1822 to 1899. This one was actually made in 1900. So just a year after it would have officially phased out of use. The hilt is kind of a classic French style, kind of modeled off the 1882 infantry officer sword and fancied up quite a lot with all these Romanian motifs. Like we have this wonderful eagle pommel here, but this is very much a cavalry.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, again, if I were using this, I have that reach advantage, but I mean, you can feel this is not a sword you really want to duel with on foot if you can help it. It'll deliver. Yeah, it would be little. If you get that first cut, right? If you get your first cut, that's great because you got that. What is that? Is that 40 inches? I mean, 37 and a half.
30. So okay, quite a long blade. And Chinese is interesting. You do see some Chinese sabers. I don't have one here for us to look at. Basically, like this form, like this. Usually there's Goose, Quill, but not always. That are. Maybe this is a little bit long one, but Dao are generally around 28 inches long. This one is a little longer. It was an officer's piece, so he, went for a little bit more. Although it's balanced beautifully, right? I mean, it's really fast, right? I mean, you can feel that one. It's a really fast blade, even though it's.
That's unreasonably nice.
It's a very nice. It's a very nice piece.
Well, you see a wide blade like this, and you do not expect that it's going to feel this alive in the hand.
No.
This blade, for lack of better phrasing, wants to do things.
I think that would cut like a demon. Be nice
absolutely.
too. Maybe at 7-star swords, maybe we'll reproduce that one sometime, and you can really cut stuff up and see how it goes.
Well, start that layaway program, and I'll get one.
That's the savior. Put some little money, put some in a cookie jar every couple of days. But I could still see. I mean, you could be relatively defensive on foot and just wait. But yeah, if you deliver one cut and it goes just like there, if you're tired and your arm swings too far, you'd really be in trouble with that on foot. But the Chinese, and maybe that's why, I never thought about this before, the few, and they're fairly far and few between, I'd say, where you see Chinese sabers that are what I would call cavalry length. They're clearly for mounted use. Those, and you can feel they're a little more forward, tip heavy. So, obviously you wouldn't Just as with this longer saber, it wouldn't come around for you fast enough. It'd be the tendency to overcarry. But they're fairly far and few between. I mean, I've handled now about 4,000. Recently in Shanghai, I was able to see a nice collection with about 300 and some pieces. So we're kind of up to my estimate of how many pieces I've been able to handle. But I've only seen a few of those that are sort of, this much longer, So Chinese seem to have stuck with a saber, probably because, on horseback, they're primarily archers. And they also use their matchlocks quite a bit on horseback. Sometimes you see illustrations where the guy has a matchlock on his back, or he's firing a matchlock, but he's got his, once you can't load or reload a muzzle loader on horseback very easily. So they use that maybe once and switch to their bow. And the saber is really that last resort weapon. So maybe that's why they stuck with this is obviously totally conjecture, but maybe that's why they stuck with a blade length that was not as maybe optimized for horseback, but still would have been really good on their feet.
No, that just makes sense.
You can sort of see that because they didn't really use the saber so much on horseback. They were using the other weapons primarily, So, and if you're that, they would use their bows up to just a few meters away. So you can they could always wheel around and go back. So interesting. There's always these things you kind of think like, I'm not sure how we did that. Why is that? I don't know. Let's think about it.
Well, you touched on something kind of interesting with this sword. I mean, like I mentioned, I wouldn't want to fence with this thing.
Yeah, I can see why it would be a problem.
I could see, as you said, using this very defensively and waiting for that, perfect moment. Because thankfully, this is held together well enough, despite being an antique, that I have swung it around a fair bit.
Yeah, got to be careful with that.
It pulls on the wrist, even when you are just kind of swinging fairly lightly. And so in my head, I'm thinking, well, okay, I'm probably going to parry a number of cuts and wait until he makes a fatal mistake, and then I will throw my committed cut. Because with something like this...
So I'd have to bait you.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, bait you and then catch it and get in.
Yeah.
And
it definitely, I mean, if we're comparing swords, again, this is still much thinner, like, a lot of these European sabers are. This has a decent heft to it. So
I think that would cut.
Well.
Oh, yeah.
And it still has a fair bit of edge.
Yeah, I mean, that would do a job cutting. I mean, it's very wide fuller there, and that really increases cutting efficiency, because it's fairly, I think it's fairly thick at the edge, kind of like we're talking about the difference in width between these blades and how that makes it for a thicker edge. You can feel this is a fairly thick, robust edge, which you would need if you're on horse, because you're going to collide with things. But by having this very wide fuller behind that, and there's another thinner one here that's really for the structural integrity, that means very little of the blade's surface is going to be in contact with the target. So very little friction. I mean, that's one of the reasons, that is the primary reason to have this wide fuller, so that you don't have that friction. So yeah, I think that would, especially when you're moving on horse, I mean, this is more, if you can think of edges from thin like a razor blade to wide and robust like an axe blade, that with a spectrum, right? Then this is moving toward the axe end, very robust, solid edge. So yeah, but very different to see that. Interesting to see how the European, that's it. So that's a difference we should really note. That European sabers, horseback cavalry sabers versus infantry, are definitely two types. Whereas in China, we do have two types, but we're not seeing very widespread use of ones that are dedicated for horseback. Where, so I'd say that, if you're on horse, your Dao is going to be the same one you're going to use on foot.
Right.
So that's interesting, kind of different. So at least as far as we can tell from the material we have today, and you just don't see those extra long ones, the ones that are just 2 or 3 inches longer. They're fairly rare.
And that's kind of interesting because, I mean, like, with a sample size that big, you would think if they were more popular, just by default, you would see more.
Yes, well, that's right. I mean, we need a big sample to obviously begin to make any kind of conclusions, but that's big enough.
Yeah. Of reasonable size.
Yes. The other thing I'm always kind of curious about is, the interaction of these swords. What were the swords during that period when Europeans were messing about in China, especially like the Opium War? It wasn't just the British, of course. The French were also there. Americans were there. A lot of powers were doing naughty things in China at the, from the middle of the Qing onward. Especially, the Opium War is probably the best known. So I'm always curious to see how these matchups might have gone. and how evolution changed, because you get that Pipeback, which was a failure, right? I mean, it was the British took that idea from the Turkish T-back saber and modified it. And rather than use the Turkish design, they changed it, and it failed. It wasn't a good thing. But they went for a lighter, faster sword, and longer. A lighter, faster, longer saber. Chinese didn't do that. They went kind of the opposite way, right? This is an oxtail. So the three major types of make up almost the entirety of Chinese saber types during the Qing are the Goose Quill, the willow leaf, and the oxtail. Oxtail for the obvious, and everybody knows it's flares toward the end, so it's like the shape of an ox's tail. And I should point out here, these two are military swords. This one, very definitely an officer. Officers, Bannerman had to purchase their own weapons. The troopers would have had a very similar sword, maybe not quite as long, because a little bit longer is a little more expensive, so not quite as long, but exactly the same style, just very simple fullering, maybe in guards and so on is not as nicely done. Same with the willow leaf. This one is probably one that sometimes we call like a provincial style. It's of the same type, but it probably wasn't a government forge making swords for the military, but it's of the same style. But it has some other little details that make you think, okay, this was probably a sword made for an individual. Might have still been an officer. It certainly has this wire wrap scabbard, which was really a plus, really nice, kind of hard to see today, but it's that brass inlaid into the lacquer work. So that's that's an extra. So this is definitely somebody of means, not just a low-ranking guy in the street. But those are military type. These are absolutely civilian. It's kind of funny because a lot of martial artists think that this is the Chinese saber.
Right.
This saber only even really started to appear middle of starts to appear probably early 18th century. Maybe right at the very end, by early 19th century into the 20th century. So 1800s, we're starting to see this. But, it's the earlier ones flare less. So as time goes on, the ratio between the width at the fort of the blade and the width at the widest grows. But it's not standardized. So you can have this one is probably fairly late, even though, let's say this is 19th century, even though the style is one that could be from the earlier part of the earlier part of the century. The interesting thing about these, though, and the general thinking is that these give a more robust cut, a very focused cut. And of course, the more that swells, the more that becomes more axe-like. So as you're seeing militiamen, boxers, so to speak, martial artists, rebels of all various kinds, but also particularly local militias that have to do the fighting because the Manchus weren't, they said that's a police action, so the military wouldn't get involved. They're going for a sword that hits harder. It's not faster, but hits harder. And I think that's talking about the training. If you've had a minimal amount of training and you have to go out and fight soldiers, well, you can't outskill them, and you're probably not as fast as they are. But if you have the confidence, well, if I just hit them once, you're going to really do them in. I think this is really the idea behind the oxtail, So so it's interesting because if you compare that, which is probably pretty much the same period of this British Pipeback, you would wield these completely different fashion. I have no training in this. You pick it up and go like, well, I'm not going to use this like a Dao. It won't move like a Dao, And
I wouldn't dare try to move this like a British military saber.
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, they can't. You can't have trained in one or the other, and then just swap.
I'm gonna give myself carpal tunnel if I try to use this thing like that.
Definitely. So it's interesting to see the Europeans are going more for speed. It seems to me. Would you agree that? Right?
Well, and they get more thrust-centric with time. Like as the 19th century progresses, they get pointier and pointier. They go for more straight blades.
Right.
You start to see stuff that looks a little bit more like this as time progresses. Whereas in China, from everything you've told me and all the swords that I've seen, they go the opposite way. They're like, no, I want to take pieces off this guy when I hit him. So
I always think of if you're not sure where you're going to hit him, just hit him hard. I think that's the idea with those. But it's interesting to see they're definitely taking completely different routes, right?
Yeah.
So, and interesting here, just for comparison here, see this has what's sometimes called Doucher, this sort of file work at the fork of the blade here. But this is a good quality sword. You know, I think people often misunderstand about swords in general, and particularly about Chinese swords, is that you see a blade like this. This is definitely what you would call a provincial piece, right? This was made for a martial artist, and you know, probably somebody didn't have a lot of money, but it's nicely decorated. So it some means, and you have those Doucher or Dao teeth on the back, but this does as well. But look at the difference. I mean, the file work here and the file work there are really different. So, you know, depending on how deep your pockets are, how much silver you got, can you afford something like this with a very nice fullering that is really precisely cut, or, you know, like this where the fullering is really so-so. You know, I mean, a good polisher could clean this up a little bit, but I wouldn't do that because it's, I mean, if I run my fingers like this, you can feel like it's a little bit wavy, but the quality of the steel is the same. So people often think like, well, because this fullering isn't as crisp and sharp and, you know, not as perfect, and the teeth, it's got that little sort of bamboo styling there, it's this Doucher, Dao teeth, that, you know, it's not as good. But steel-wise, it's not. Steel-wise, they're the same because it has to be. You can't use crappy steel. The sword will break or bend, and you're in real trouble.
Right.
So even though it's not as fancy, quote fancy, it's not a high-ranking officer's sword, that's really good steel. So, but now what's this?
That piece too, actually.
Yeah, it's very nice. It's very honest, right? It's like, this is a sword made for fighting, and we did some things to make it look nice.
It has a well-to-do working class vibe that I really appreciate.
Yeah, no, that's actually a good way to say it. It's a working class saber, right? So now tell us about this. It's like KD
So this
89,
is
is it?
definitely built off of or designed after the KD 89, a Prussian sword. But this is actually a Chilean fiscal police sword. So the joke I often give is, imagine if the IRS came to your door with weapons drawn. Gently terrifying thought, actually.
Right.
But this one, you know, it's got that, you know, straight pipeback blade with that little bit of a quill point here. It feels quite nice in the hand. It's not quite as lively as, say, this 1822 sword, but it definitely wants to move, although moving for the thrust, you know, rather
And that Bakelite grip.
Unfortunately, that piece has lost some of that Bakelite, but, you know.
Well, no, what's really interesting about this is I have handled, and I have a similar one. The Chinese also used these very late in the Dynasty when they had the Beiyang army. They adopted European weapons, and they have this, you know, the Germans made these in large numbers for everybody, and they have this little cartouche here. So this has the Chilean cartouche, but the Chinese ones have a very German-style dragon. It's sort of like, yeah, I guess that's a dragon. It doesn't really look like a Chinese dragon, but they have a dragon there for the Chinese ones. And the Chinese also made knockoffs of those. So we have a whole, if you're interested, you can look for we have a whole, I'll link it down below. We did a whole long video on the Chinese sabers of the late Qing. So these new army sabers. So this is also a pipeback though, but it's much more rigid than the British one. I think the blade feels like it's thicker, eh?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's much thicker through here, and then it bevels down, kind of like we're talking about with the other cavalry saber. But you can definitely feel like this one you could give the point. You know?
Whereas this sword, kind of like you were talking about the Crimean War, I don't know that I want to stab anything with it.
No, I don't.
You know, certainly no one that was wearing heavy cloth of any kind. No. Whereas that sword, okay, I have confidence that will pierce.
This is really different. There's the way that pipe goes down to the tip too. That really is going to back that up for a solid thrust. Mm-hmm. And so that's another difference between Daofa, Chinese Daofa, with any of these blades. Even those Goose Quill that we looked at first, you can use the thrust, but the thrust is not the primary thing. So Europeans are going for longer, lighter, presumably faster blades with more use of the point, whereas Chinese are going slower in a way, heavier cut, more curve, right? Greater curve, and so you barely can use the tip at all many times. And some of them very definitely are curved so much that there's no way you can really bring the tip to bear. So Critic Curious, they trying to solve the same problem in very different ways.
Yeah, very much so. And it's, I mean, of course, this feels like the classic young boy question, but who wins in a fight? But
Yeah.
I think all of these matchups would actually be fascinating to see.
Yes,
We've
definitely.
touched on each one,
Definitely.
even those 3 Dao, which if you don't know much about Dao, they might look fairly similar, but each one has a fundamentally different feel.
Yeah.
Particularly the one on your rightmost has a...
I think that this would be the one,
feel.
I've done some work, I've played people who do military saber with my Jin, and I can, because of the point of balance is closer to the guard, I can stir around and reposition my blade quickly enough, so when the guys have the lighter blade, I don't have a problem matching their speed. Be interesting to see, could that be with a saber? I think of all of these, if I had to fight a guy with the faster blade, I'd go for the Goose Quill because it's a little more lively. So that makes me feel a little bit safer. So I think we're definitely going to have to get some bouting in, get some guys who are conversant with the military sabers and get them together with our boys at the Academy and suss that out and see how that's going to play out. Of course, I'm not of the kind of guy who thinks that one is better than the other. It comes down to the individuals always. Right. A really great swordsman with an inferior weapon is going to take out the guy who's got the great weapon but doesn't know how to use it, So I'm not go for that one thing is better than the other kind of thing. But interesting to see how they'll interact, and how each will try to have to adapt. So we'll have to do that. Definitely like to hear from you guys. What do you think? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the weapon? Which Chinese saber would you use facing which military saber, and vice versa? If you had the military saber, which is the Dao you'd prefer to face, so you think, because you might have an advantage. So definitely let us know. So thank you, John. Very interesting conversation. We're going to have to come back with some more swords and do this again.
Thank you, Doucher.
Stay strong, everybody. 再见.